The night art and entertainment collided. Beverly Hills, 1970. The Crystal Ballroom shimmered beneath chandeliers that had witnessed decades of ambition disguised as celebration. Inside that room sat the most powerful names in Hollywood, directors who shaped eras, producers who controlled destinies, actors who carried entire studios on their shoulders. It was an evening dedicated to artistic excellence, a phrase that meant different things depending on who you asked. At table 7 sat Dean Martin, relaxed as ever, tuxedo pressed with quiet precision, posture casual but controlled. Across the room sat Kirk Douglas, intense even at rest, eyes sharp, energy coiled beneath ceremony. The tension that would later define the evening did not begin with insult. It began with ideology. Hollywood in 1970 was in transition. The old studio glamour was fading. Younger directors were pushing boundaries. Critics were redefining prestige. Within that climate, lines were being drawn between what some called serious cinema and what others defended as pure entertainment. It was not a new debate, but it had grown louder. When Kirk stepped to the microphone to present an award for artistic contribution, the room quieted immediately. He carried authority naturally. His voice filled space without effort. He began by praising risk, ambition, the courage to challenge audiences rather than comfort them. The applause was polite but measured. Then his tone shifted, subtly but unmistakably. He spoke about compromise in the industry, about formulas replacing innovation, about repetition masquerading as success. His words were not yet directed, but they carried implication. And then he named Dean. The ballroom tightened. Dean did not flinch. He lifted his eyes slowly, acknowledging the room's attention without surrendering composure. Kirk framed his criticism as philosophical, but the undertone was unmistakable. He questioned whether popularity equaled artistry. He suggested that repetition diluted integrity. He implied that some performers coasted on charm rather than craft. The word hack did not land as a shout. It landed as emphasis. Gasps traveled discreetly between tables. No one in that room had ever seen a peer targeted so openly at an industry celebration. It was not standard decorum. It was not subtle rivalry. It was a challenge disguised as commentary. Dean did not interrupt. He did not whisper to his tablemates. He did not storm out. But he listened until Kirk finished, and the applause, thinner now, faded into uncertain silence. Dinner resumed, but no one tasted their food. Shirley MacLaine leaned toward Dean, her voice barely audible. "Are you going to let that stand?" Dean's expression remained unreadable. "He said what he believes." Frank Sinatra, seated nearby, bristled visibly, but Dean's hand resting lightly on his arm prevented escalation. That gesture alone revealed something crucial. Dean was not rattled, not publicly. After dessert, during the intermission between speeches, Dean rose calmly and crossed the ballroom. Conversations paused mid-sentence. He approached Kirk, not with aggression, but with intention. "Can we step outside for a moment?" he asked quietly. They moved to the terrace overlooking Los Angeles. City lights scattered below like distant applause. Within minutes, curiosity drew a crowd, not openly, not brazenly, but close enough to hear. Dean began without raised voice. He asked Kirk whether he truly believed entertainment lacked merit, whether joy was inherently lesser than provocation, whether making people laugh required less skill than making them uncomfortable. His tone was not defensive, it was analytical. Kirk responded with conviction. He spoke of responsibility, of pushing boundaries, of elevating audiences rather than soothing them. His words were articulate, passionate, sincere, but beneath them lay something Dean recognized immediately: insecurity masked as superiority. Dean stepped closer, not to intimidate, but to clarify. He explained that mastery of tone is craft. That sustaining lightness without slipping into triviality is discipline, that creating accessibility for millions without sacrificing quality is not accident, it is expertise. He did not diminish Kirk's work. He did not question his intensity. He simply refused the premise that one approach invalidated another. Then he asked a question that shifted the balance entirely. Is art defined by how much it hurts? The terrace grew still. Dean continued. He described the value of relief in a world saturated with tension. He described the responsibility entertainers hold when offering escape. He described the invisible labor behind making something feel effortless. He did not posture. He did not sermonize. He spoke as a craftsman defending his craft. Kirk's posture shifted gradually from defiance to contemplation. And the audience on the terrace sensed it. This was no longer confrontation. It was recalibration. Dean concluded with something that resonated long after the night ended. There's room for your films and mine. The mistake is thinking there isn't. It was not delivered as a threat. It was delivered as fact. Kirk, known for intensity, did something unexpected. He acknowledged the point. Not immediately, not dramatically, but clearly. He admitted that public criticism had crossed a line. That disagreement did not require humiliation. That passion for one form of cinema did not necessitate contempt for another. The apology, when it came, was direct. No shouting, no theatrics, just recognition. Inside the ballroom, when Kirk returned to the microphone and publicly clarified his remarks, the applause that followed felt different. But it was not for dominance. It was for dignity. Dean did not smile triumphantly. He returned to his table and resumed his seat as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But something had shifted within that room. The binary between art and entertainment had cracked. The assumption that seriousness equaled superiority had been challenged without hostility. The legend would later exaggerate the moment, claiming Dean put him on his knees. The truth was quieter and more powerful. Dean put ego on its knees. And that was only the beginning. The philosophy of craft. The morning after the Crystal Ballroom incident did not explode with scandal the way some might have expected. There were no screaming headlines accusing Kirk Douglas of cruelty or declaring Dean Martin victorious in some theatrical duel. Instead, the story traveled the way most meaningful moments in Hollywood travel. Quietly, through private phone calls, hushed lunches at the Polo Lounge, and late-night conversations in studio offices where reputation is weighed more carefully than gossip. What lingered was not the insult itself, but the composure with which it had been answered. Dean returned home that night to a house that felt blissfully indifferent to industry politics. The air was still, the city distant. He poured himself a modest drink, one, not as performance, but as ritual, and sat alone in his study. The word hack did not wound him in the way some assumed. He had endured critics his entire career. What unsettled him was the broader implication, that joy was somehow inferior to gravitas, that popularity implied compromise, that ease was mistaken for shallowness. It was a narrative he had encountered since the beginning of his film career, and though he rarely addressed it publicly, he had thought about it more deeply than anyone suspected. Dean understood something that often escapes critics. Simplicity is rarely simple. To appear effortless on screen requires control so complete it becomes invisible. To make audiences relax, laugh, and forget their burdens for 2 hours demands emotional calibration as precise as any dramatic monologue. He knew that lightness without sincerity collapses into parody. He knew that repetition without nuance becomes hollow. The fact that his performances felt familiar did not mean they were lazy. It meant he had refined a tone audiences trusted. But trust in art is rarely respected as highly as risk. Meanwhile, Kirk spent his own restless night reconsidering the terrace exchange. He had built his career on intensity, on transformation, on pushing himself and others to uncomfortable limits. His performances had required physical exhaustion and emotional volatility. That process had become intertwined with his identity as an artist. To him, struggle equaled authenticity. Yet Dean's quiet rebuttal unsettled that assumption. What if struggle was not the only path to meaning? What if accessibility did not automatically imply compromise? The industry began reacting in subtle ways. Directors who specialized in large-scale entertainment films found renewed confidence in defending their work publicly. Cinematographers who had long felt overshadowed by art house prestige began speaking more openly about craft rather than genre hierarchy. Even younger actors, who often felt pressured to pursue serious roles for validation, began reassessing what success meant to them. Dean had not delivered a manifesto, but he had articulated something that many had privately felt, that the dichotomy between art and entertainment was false. A week later, Dean received a call from a respected European filmmaker known for philosophical dramas. The director surprised him by expressing admiration for his handling of the confrontation. "You reframed the argument," the man said. "You did not defend commerce. You defended craft." That distinction resonated deeply. Dean had never viewed himself as a merchant of shallow spectacle. He viewed himself as a technician of mood. His films might not dissect existential despair, but they required rhythm, chemistry, timing, and emotional sincerity. Those elements were no less deliberate than the construction of tragedy. Kirk, too, began encountering shifts in tone. At a dinner hosted by fellow producers, one colleague cautiously observed that audiences did not always attend films to be challenged. Sometimes they attended to reconnect with joy. The remark might once have irritated him. Now it provoked reflection. He realized that in his effort to elevate discourse, he had inadvertently dismissed experiences that held equal legitimacy. He had mistaken preference for principle. The most significant transformation occurred not publicly, but privately. Kirk began reevaluating his approach on set. His reputation for intensity had long been tolerated because of results, but he started questioning whether fear-driven excellence was sustainable. He thought back to Dean's comment about how art is also defined by how collaborators are treated. That remark had struck deeper than he initially admitted. It reframed artistry not solely as product, but as process. During a rehearsal for an upcoming project, a young actor stumbled through a difficult scene. Kirk's instinct was to correct sharply, to demand higher precision. Instead, he paused. He asked questions rather than issuing commands. The adjustment was small but noticeable. The rehearsal improved not because of intimidation, but because of trust. For the first time, he experienced creative momentum without friction. It unsettled him in a productive way. Back in Los Angeles, Dean noticed subtle changes in how he was addressed at events. Critics who had once described him as reliably charming began using language like disciplined and strategic. It amused him. He had not altered his approach, he had merely explained it. Yet articulation carries power. By refusing to accept a hierarchy imposed by others, he had redefined his position within it. Months later, the two men encountered each other again at another industry gathering. The energy between them was different, not tense, not adversarial, but reflective. Kirk approached Dean without spectacle. He admitted that the confrontation had forced him to reconsider his assumptions. He did not abandon his commitment to serious cinema, nor did Dean abandon his mastery of entertainment. What shifted was the mutual recognition that purpose varies without diminishing value. And the broader cultural debate about art versus entertainment did not vanish overnight. It never does. But the narrative began to include nuance. Journalists referenced the Terrace Exchange as an example of disagreement handled with dignity. Younger filmmakers cited it when discussing the coexistence of genre diversity. What could have remained a petty feud evolved into a case study in intellectual humility. Dean never claimed victory. He did not relish the idea of having won. His satisfaction came from clarity rather than conquest. He had defended his work without belittling another's. He had exposed insecurity without humiliation. In doing so, he demonstrated a rare quality in an industry fueled by ego: steadiness. Kirk, in turn, learned that intensity without empathy narrows perspective. His art did not diminish because he acknowledged alternative approaches. In fact, it deepened. By allowing room for other philosophies, he enriched his own. The terrace confrontation became less about rivalry and more about revelation. It revealed that disagreement, when approached without cruelty, can catalyze growth. It revealed that dignity under pressure commands more respect than aggression ever could. And it revealed that sometimes the most transformative conversations occur not through victory, but through listening. The philosophy of craft that emerged from that night lingered in Hollywood long after the applause faded. It was a reminder that art is not singular in form, that value is not confined to solemnity, and that mastery of joy is as deliberate as mastery of tragedy. And the story was not finished yet. At the transformation of respect. In the months that followed the Crystal Ballroom exchange, something subtle but profound began unfolding across Hollywood. It did not arrive with fanfare or public declarations. It manifested in tone shifts, in conversations once whispered now spoken with measured confidence, and in the gradual recalibration of how creative work was evaluated. The night when Dean Martin defended his craft against Kirk Douglas had cracked open a conversation that many in the industry had avoided for years. What began as confrontation matured into reflection, and reflection, when allowed to breathe, often transforms perception. Dean did not campaign to redefine himself. He continued working exactly as he always had, arriving prepared, respecting crews, rehearsing diligently even when the part seemed effortless. But the way colleagues observed him shifted. Directors who once categorized him as commercial began noticing the technical precision beneath his performances. Cinematographers paid closer attention to how he controlled tempo within a scene. Editors remarked on how consistently he delivered usable takes without exhausting the crew. What once appeared casual was now understood as calibrated restraint. Familiarity had hidden sophistication. Clarity revealed it. Meanwhile, Kirk experienced his own reckoning, though it was quieter and more personal. For years, he had equated intensity with authenticity, believing that art required friction, that brilliance demanded pressure. He had worn his volatility almost as proof of dedication. Yet Dean's terrace argument lingered in his thoughts. The idea that process shapes product began unsettling his long-held assumptions. He found himself observing his own behavior on set with unusual awareness. When impatience surfaced, he paused. When frustration threatened to harden into criticism, he reconsidered tone. He began asking himself whether control truly enhanced creativity or merely gratified ego. The change did not happen overnight, nor did it erase his intensity, but it softened its edges. Actors who worked with him during this period later described a noticeable shift. He still demanded excellence, but he no longer wielded intimidation as casually. He listened more often. He allowed room for alternative interpretations. What he discovered surprised him. Collaboration deepened the work. Scenes gained nuance when others felt safe enough to contribute. But emotional authenticity flourished when fear retreated. Industry observers started recognizing a broader cultural shift as well. The rigid divide between serious and entertaining cinema began to blur in public discourse. Critics who had once dismissed accessible films reconsidered their metrics. Younger filmmakers cited Dean's philosophy when defending projects that balanced levity with craft. It became increasingly difficult to argue that popularity invalidated merit when evidence of discipline and audience connection coexisted so clearly. Dean himself remained characteristically understated about the transformation. In interviews, when asked about artistic integrity, he spoke simply about knowing one's strengths. He described craft as consistency. He emphasized respect for collaborators. He rarely referenced the incident directly, but those familiar with the industry understood its impact. By articulating his philosophy without contempt, he had shifted the narrative without creating enemies. Kirk's respect for Dean grew not out of obligation, but from observation. He began noticing the loyalty Dean inspired among crews. Camera operators spoke of him with admiration. Lighting technicians appreciated his punctuality. Supporting actors described feeling at ease in scenes with him. Kirk realized that professionalism, when sustained over decades, generates a different kind of legacy, one measured in trust rather than trophies. Awards decorate walls, respect fills rooms. Their next significant public encounter occurred at a charity event months later. The air between them carried none of the former tension. They greeted each other without spectacle, and their exchange felt genuine rather than performative. Reporters watched carefully, hoping for residual friction. Instead, they witnessed something more compelling: mutual acknowledgement. It was not dramatic reconciliation. It was quiet equilibrium. During a panel discussion that evening about the future of cinema, the moderator invited both men to comment on the evolving industry. Kirk spoke about risk and experimentation. Dean spoke about connection and accessibility. Rather than contradicting each other, their perspectives complemented one another. For the first time, audiences saw how the two philosophies might coexist rather than compete. It was not compromise, it was synthesis. Privately, Kirk later admitted that the most humbling aspect of the entire episode was recognizing how narrowly he had defined excellence. And his commitment to pushing boundaries had blinded him to other forms of mastery. Dean's steadiness, once mistaken for complacency, now appeared as quiet strength. That realization reshaped not only his view of Dean, but his understanding of his own craft. He began exploring subtler performances, allowing vulnerability to replace sheer intensity. Critics noted a shift in his later roles, a greater softness layered beneath resolve. For Dean, the transformation was less about external validation and more about internal affirmation. He had always believed in the value of joy, but articulating that belief publicly reinforced his confidence in it. The confrontation had forced him to define what he stood for beyond box office numbers. It clarified that entertainment, when executed with care and sincerity, holds emotional weight equal to any solemn drama. That clarity deepened his sense of purpose. The ripple effects extended beyond the two men. Studio executives began reconsidering how they framed marketing campaigns. Rather than positioning films as either artistic statements or crowd pleasers, some projects embraced dual identity. Writers found renewed confidence in blending humor with depth. Actors who previously feared being labeled lightweight began defending versatility as strength rather than compromise. What made this transformation enduring was its absence of spectacle. There were no press conferences declaring philosophical revolution. There were no triumphant speeches about victory. There was only evolution, gradual, authentic, grounded in humility. The terrace argument had not ended with dominance. It had ended with awareness. And awareness, once awakened, rarely returns to sleep. Years later, when industry retrospectives revisited the incident, it was often framed as a pivotal cultural moment rather than a personal feud. Scholars of cinema referenced it when discussing genre hierarchies. Biographers cited it as a testament to Dean's composure and Kirk's capacity for growth. What endured was not the insult, but the example, that dignity under criticism can reframe an entire conversation. Respect, they learned, is not seized through volume. It is earned through steadiness. It is not fortified by belittling others, but by articulating conviction without contempt. Dean demonstrated that night that confidence requires no cruelty. Kirk demonstrated in the months after that humility strengthens rather than weakens authority. The transformation of respect between them did not erase their differences. It refined them. They remained distinct artists with distinct philosophies, but they no longer perceived those philosophies as threats. Instead, they recognized them as complementary threads within a vast creative tapestry. And the legacy of that realization would echo far beyond that terrace. The legacy of balance time has a way of sanding down sharp moments until what remains is not the sting, but the lesson. The night at the Beverly Hills Hotel did not become legendary because Kirk Douglas insulted Dean Martin. Hollywood had seen insults before and would see them again. It became legendary because of how it ended. It became part of industry folklore not as a feud, but as a turning point, a rare moment when ego met composure and chose growth over escalation. In the years that followed, both men entered a different phase of their careers. The frantic competition of youth softened into legacy-building reflection. Younger actors emerged with new techniques and louder cultural influence. Directors experimented with form in ways that made previous debates seem almost quaint. Yet the conversation sparked on that terrace continued to echo. It resurfaced whenever critics dismissed popular films as shallow. It resurfaced whenever performers were pressured to abandon what they did best in pursuit of validation. It resurfaced quietly in conversations about what art is supposed to do. Dean remained consistent. That was his quiet power. He did not suddenly pivot toward prestige projects to prove a point. He did not seek critical redemption. He continued refining what he had already mastered: tone, timing, chemistry, emotional accessibility. His later performances carried a slightly deeper undercurrent, perhaps shaped by maturity, perhaps by the clarity that came from having defended his philosophy publicly. There was an added intentionality to his ease. He understood now that what looked effortless could be misunderstood, and so he embraced that paradox with even greater discipline. Colleagues noticed something else as well. Dean became more vocal in private about protecting younger actors from the industry's harsher judgments. When a newcomer was dismissed as too commercial or too lightweight, Dean would often remind people that longevity matters more than temporary acclaim. He spoke about sustaining connection with audiences. He emphasized the value of reliability. Without preaching, and he modeled an alternative metric for success. Kirk, on the other hand, evolved in a different direction. His intensity never disappeared. It was woven into his personality, but it became tempered with perspective. He began acknowledging publicly that art need not be singular in purpose. In interviews during the late 1970s and 1980s, he spoke about collaboration with newfound appreciation. He reflected on how humility sharpened creativity rather than diminishing it. Those who worked with him during his later years often described a man still demanding but more measured, more aware of how his energy shaped a room. The most revealing testament to the transformation between them came not in grand reconciliations, but in ordinary interactions. At industry events, they spoke easily. There was no visible tension, no performative exaggeration of friendship, just mutual recognition. They had passed through disagreement and emerged not identical, but aligned in respect. Their philosophies remained distinct, but neither felt threatened by the other's existence. When retrospectives on cinema history began emerging in later decades, scholars and commentators often revisited the broader debate about art versus entertainment. The terrace incident became a reference point, not because it settled the argument, but because it illuminated its false dichotomy. The legacy of that night was not about one man winning. It was about demonstrating that craft manifests in multiple forms. It was about challenging the assumption that seriousness equals superiority. As both men aged, mortality inevitably reframed priorities. Public feuds fade in significance when measured against time. What endures are the moments that reveal character. When Dean passed away in 1995, tributes focused heavily on his charm, his music, his films. But within industry circles, quieter stories circulated. Stories about his composure under pressure, about the night he articulated a defense not just of himself, but of an entire category of artists. His legacy extended beyond entertainment. It included dignity. Kirk, in his later reflections, reportedly acknowledged that the confrontation had forced him to confront his own rigidity. He recognized that conviction without openness hardens into arrogance. He spoke about the importance of allowing room for other creative philosophies. In doing so, and he demonstrated something rare in high-profile careers, the capacity to evolve publicly without sacrificing identity. The deeper lesson of that night lies in balance. Art that challenges and art that comforts both hold power. Drama and comedy, intensity and ease, provocation and pleasure, these are not opposing forces but complementary ones. Hollywood, like any cultural landscape, thrives when diversity of approach is embraced rather than ranked. Dean's greatest victory was not silencing a critic. It was articulating a truth that resonated far beyond the ballroom. Kirk's greatest strength in the aftermath was not dominance but reflection. Together, unintentionally, they modeled a path rarely taken in public disagreement. Defend firmly, listen honestly, grow visibly. In the end, no one remembers the insult with clarity. What people remember is the poise, the steadiness, the refusal to retaliate with cruelty, the insistence that joy is not lesser than gravity. That process matters as much as product. That respect is not diminished by difference. The Crystal Ballroom confrontation did not alter the course of cinema overnight, but it nudged the conversation toward nuance. It reminded an industry addicted to spectacle that dignity carries more weight than drama. It proved that standing firm without hostility is possible even in a room full of egos. Years later, when younger generations study the careers of both men, they will see more than box office numbers or awards. They will see two artists who represented different creative philosophies. They will see a moment when those philosophies clashed publicly. And they will see how that clash matured into understanding rather than bitterness. That is the legacy of balance. Not the absence of disagreement, but the presence of grace within it. Not the triumph of one vision over another, but the coexistence of many. And on that night in March 1970, under chandeliers heavy with expectation, Dean Martin demonstrated that true class does not shout. It simply stands, calm, confident, unshaken, and allows truth to do the work.